Okay, I'm just going to delete the curve that I've got in here from when we created the low poly and delete all history. Now this model I'm going to need to subdivide. So when I smooth it, it needs to maintain its shape, and that's because we're going into Mudbox. So the first thing I'm doing is making a new layer and calling that LP for low poly, and duplicating the object and putting it on a new layer and calling that HP for high poly. So you can see here when I turn this on and off, it jumps between the low poly and the high poly, which is currently the same model. So now I've just deleted all of these triangles. It's very important for anything that's going into Mudbox. It's entirely quads. So here I've selected the top and the bottom edges there and then clicked on bridge to connect them. And with the divisions set, I'm just clicking in the viewport and moving that up to 3. So I've got 3 divisions, and using the target world, I'm just connecting those 3 edge loops to the 3 outside edges to continue that. As we can see now, they're all quads. So a pretty simple adjustment there. Now I'm just making some adjustments to the vertices. We just want to make sure that's nice and even, evenly distributed and fairly clean geometry. Just selecting all those verts and going into normal, soften edge to make sure that we don't have any obvious hard edges, and unhiding the rest of the model. I'm just creating a cube. For this lock, I need to rebuild the model, just this section, because that's all in triangles. It's going to be much easier just to quickly rebuild it than it is to actually try to turn the triangles into quads. Sometimes just rebuilding something is the quickest way. So I've made a cube and I'm trying to decide how many edges. So I'll count how many edges I need to maintain this same shape as the low poly. Starts up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So I want 15 edges all up, which means 13 divisions plus the extra 2 at the top of the start and end. So I've done that to get to the exact number of edges that I need to match what I've already got. So I've just deleted everything except the top and right side, because we're going to duplicate the others. And now in the front view here, I'm just moving each vert to align with the original shape. And I'm only focusing on the outside to start with, so it's just a matter of matching these up. Actually, a quicker way to do this would have been to turn on snap to vert, but this is working just fine. So as you can see, I've simply cleaned up that model just to make sure it's entirely in quads, but those edge loops kind of fan out around the lock shape. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to recreate that shape in quads, is simply rebuilding it like that. And you can see when I smooth it there, it collapses a little. I've double clicked each of those edge loops and making sure I've got exactly the edges that I want selected. I can click on bevel, and I'm just changing the offset. I've got 2 segments in the bevel, but changing the offset to be a little wider. And we can see when we smooth it by hitting 3 to smooth preview, that's got a nice soft edge. But we need a little bit more detail, a little more subdivision in order to maintain the shape that we're after. So now I'm using the Multicut tool, holding down Control, and just clicking where I want to insert an edge loop. I'm adding 2 because one will add as fencing or a control loop. So that controls the shape of the smoothing as we subdivide. Just snapping the pivot to the center, and I'm going to duplicate this model over. Control D to duplicate. -1 in the scale X, and then shift select the original and combine. Now I just need to select all of my verts and merge those. So I've drag selected all of the verts in the middle. We can see it's 36 verts in the display there. I've just reset the merge vertex tools, and now when I click it, it goes to 18. If I drag select a single vert, we see 1. So now I'm double clicking the edge loop on the inside of that keyhole, and what I'm doing is extruding those faces out a little. extruding those faces back a little and just moving them back in the Z there to make sure they go backwards. So I need some faces in there in order to be able to bevel the outside edge and maintain that sharp shape to the keyhole. Just moving that edge back a little, make the keyhole shape a little deeper, double clicking the inside edge loop to select them. And now that when I click on bevel, that bevels nicely. It's gone green, it's just a visual display problem. Open up Hypershade and reattach a grey Lambert, default Lambert. Brings the colour back, it's not a problem, it's just a weird bug. I've beveled at the base of this keyhole to maintain those hard edges, the corners at the bottom there. I just need to widen those a little. Now the side here, I need this to maintain hard edges, which means it also needs to have an edge loop or a bevel. So I'm just using the Multicut tool to connect a horizontal line. We can see what that's done there is create this connection. Selecting these two edges and delete edge vertex, or you can hit Control Delete on the keyboard. So that's maintained quads. And that lets me bevel without that bevel going in towards the center there, the top of the keyhole section. So just smooth preview by hitting 3 and taking a look at the result. Make sure that's basically what I'm after. It's to make sure it's maintaining that hard edge, that hard corner. Now I've got the same problem with the top of the keyhole. It's bending outwards a little too softly. So if we insert a bevel and make that offset as small as we can manage, when we smooth it, we can see that's maintaining the vertical section of the keyhole. Now down here I'm going to repeat the same thing I did above, just insert a new edge loop with the Multicut tool. Delete edge vertex, and I'll just drag that vertice up. I'm just selecting the top and the bottom edge loops because they're a little close together. But I'll just start on the outside only. I just want to scale those so they're not pinching quite so much. I'm just scaling in the X to try to make these sides match. So when we smooth that, it looks reasonable. And I'm just selecting those outside edges again. I just want to push them a little bit further. And I'm taking a look in the wireframe so I can see the low poly that we're trying to match. And checking my smooth preview. Again, in the wireframe, just checking the background to make sure that it all matches nicely. Now you can see there I'm getting some very sharp pinching. So I'll just undo Control Z. I just brought those in a little bit too far. I'm using the Multicut tool to try and insert edge loops. You can see it's not letting me go through cleanly. That can happen sometimes when your geometry gets a little bit too messy. So I'm just inserting these 3 edge loops, and then I'm using the Multicut tool to manually connect those. Just going to delete the other half and duplicate that back over when I'm done. So it let me insert an edge loop nicely and cleanly on the outside, but on the inside here I just need to manually reconnect these. But that's pretty quick and easy. So click your 2 edges and hit enter with the Multicut tool. So just make sure you get rid of any extra faces that can get created when you make a bevel. It's just a matter of selecting them and hitting delete. Just keep an eye out for those. Just going to snap the pivot to the outside there. Control D to duplicate. Duplicate this over, -X, shift select the other one, combine, and merge your verts. Just keeping an eye on that vert count in the upper top. So in the display there it says 84 verts. Click merge, it now says 54. And you'll notice that I zoomed right in on 2 sections that were close together. We just want to make sure that the threshold in the merge vertex isn't so high that we end up collapsing verts, merging verts that we don't want to merge. Okay, so just positioning that approximately at the same position. And just dragging these back sections to match the low poly, the original version. So that keyhole section, that's probably the most complex part that we need to subdivide. The rest of the model should be fairly quick. So we can see when we smooth it, the base is definitely needing some control loops to keep the edges at hard edge. Okay, just selecting the outside edge loop by double clicking as much of it as I can. When you double click, it selects most of the edge loop as far as it continues. So I'm just double checking I've got all of the edges that I want selected correctly. And clicking on bevel, once again just applying my Lambert. If it goes green, it's just a bug, not a problem. And now 3 to smooth preview, and you can see the result. It's looking fairly clean. We're getting nice smooth edges, though parts of this model need some control loops. So I'm just going to use the Multicut tool and insert a couple of edge loops there. We're trying to keep our quads relatively square. So I've got a few sections that's just a little bit, the quads are too rectangle in shape. We want to keep them squared as much as we can. Just so that when we subdivide in Mudbox, we're not getting some sections with a lot of resolution and other sections with very little resolution. You need to make sure they're all square to avoid that happening. Just selecting this top edge loop and dragging that down a little so that it's more in line with the edges on the side. So the cylinder here, the start of the door handle, I'm just using the Multicut tool, holding down Control, just to insert a selection of edge loops to quickly add these control loops, or fencing as it's often referred to. which means I'm kind of fencing in the edges to force them to remain hard-edged when we smooth it. Now before I move on and export this into Mudbox, I need to make sure there's no issues with the geometry. Specifically, I don't want any n-gons, so I'm just going to run a cleanup on the model. Now I'm selecting the model in object mode, going into mesh, cleanup. Now when you run cleanup, make sure, very important, that the very first option, which is cleanup matching polygons, is not checked. If you run it with that checked, any issues that Maya finds with your model, it will clean up automatically for you. And that may not be a good thing. It may change the model without you realizing exactly what it's changed. I strongly recommend have the second option checked, which is select matching polygons. Now we scroll down to where it says faces with more than 4 sides, which means n-gons. So any face with more than 4 sides is an n-gon, so I just have that one checked. So now that I've run it, you can see it's gone automatically into sub-object mode, into faces, and it's highlighted a couple of faces. And so they're faces that have more than 4 sides. So here we can see these n-gons. So I just need to clean those up, which you want to do manually. So pretty straightforward, just a matter of using the Multicut tool. I'm just inserting a V shape here. So it does create, obviously, triangles. But this V, you can see when we smooth the model, there's no stretching because the pinching there is happening on the face, not on a corner, which is pretty important. So I've run the cleanup again, this time with non-manifold geometry selected. So it selected these verts. I just need to work out why it's not liking those. It's not always immediately apparent why it shows issues, but if I scroll on the inside, we can find what the issue is. I've got this face that's on the inside of the model. So I'm just going into face mode and selecting it and just hitting the delete key to get rid of it. And we can see it's actually a couple of faces on top of each other. It looks like 3 or 4 faces. Most likely that's happened it has happened in the creation process. Most likely that's happened when I've beveled and it's ended up with just a small bevel in the corner that I've missed. So it's not a big deal when you have these issues. You can easily run a cleanup and find them, but it is very important that you do pay attention to issues that you, at the end of the process, go and clean it up and make sure you delete them. And I'm just going to run my cleanup again with the same tools. When we see nothing selected in the scene, that means it hasn't found anything. Also running it with laminar faces, no problems there. So we've got a clean model. I'm just deleting history, centering the pivot. I'm just snapping the pivot point to the middle of the base section of the door handle. And saving. And now I'm going export selection. I'm exporting this as an FBX. If you have an issue with an FBX, try an OBJ. And I'm calling this base. So here we are in Mudbox. New scene, I'm just going import, navigating to the model that we just exported out of Maya. And you can see what it's telling me there is there's a problem with the UV tiles. So that's not a significant problem. So navigating in Mudbox, just the same as in Maya. In the objects list, just clicking on the view option for the key lock section. So we're only looking at the base and just subdividing that up to, in this case, 4.5 million faces. Selecting my sculpt tool, just adjusting the settings. Steady stroke at 6 seems to work fairly well. Might turn that down a little. So it's kind of like lazy mouse. It's a delay in how it draws, which really helps with keeping nice smooth strokes in your sculpting. Now I'm not really looking at any reference here. This is where you can get a little bit creative. I'm just experimenting. Really this tutorial is about the workflow, so don't feel the need to copy exactly what I do, just experiment a little bit. I'll actually speed this up so you can just see the general idea. We just basically want to go in and draw a selection of ornate shapes. It might help to look at a little bit of reference, maybe a quick image search of ornate shapes or flourishes, those sorts of terms. Could probably find Some good examples of the sort of thing you're trying to do. But as I said, when I made this, I didn't look at any reference. It's just a quick example of the workflow. So using the steady stroke, we're moving nice and slow to make sure we get the shapes we want. If your model starts to get a bit rough, you can just go in with the smooth tool, either click the smooth tool or hold down your shift key with any sculpting tool, and that will make it the smooth tool. You want to go through and just smooth out any issues you might be having. So we'll speed right through this. I'm just creating these big bumps at the end here. I want those to represent bolts. I think I'll probably end up putting some bolts here in Photoshop at the end of the process. Alright, so once I'm happy with that, I need to export the model so that we can bake our normal map. So I've selected the model in the object list there and gone File, Export Selection, exporting this as an OBJ. So just navigate to where you want to save it, obviously inside your project folder. Now this is the high poly model. It's 4.5 million polys. So back in Maya, I just want to do the lock section. So I've just smoothed it in Maya, mesh smooth. So that just gives me a nice starting point for our subdivision. Deleting its history, exporting it into an OBJ. I'll do the same with the handle. We'll just smooth the whole handle. Mesh smooth. Delete its history, export selection. So what I'm doing here is exporting each individual component on its own so that we can bake our texture maps in XNormal individually. So essentially what that is called is an exploded workflow, where we are exploding our model into components and exporting them individually and then baking them, letting the baking software XNormal to bake them without any additional issues. So the final piece is this cylinder section that the handle goes through, so we'll just smooth that. I'm actually combining those, so those two pieces as an individual piece. We'll just center the pivot, delete its history, and export selection. So in this case, I've got these three components, the handle, the base, and the lock, and I've called them handle 01, 02, and 03. Just remember that the base, with the first one, was what I exported out of Mudbox. So that's a very high poly model. And you can see that that's 276 megabyte, so it's very large compared to the other components that I just exported out of Maya. So here in XNormal, we just need to import our high definition meshes in the first button there. So I right click and say add meshes, and just navigate to where I've saved those files. And I'm selecting all three at once and clicking add. And then the low definition meshes, I'm right clicking and selecting the low poly, which I've saved as _LP. So I'm just navigating to where I want to save these textures. So I'm saving it in my project folder, source images, and I've got a folder on there, handle. And all I'm doing is clicking on normal map and ambient occlusion. I've set it to 2048 by 2048 and clicking bake. So we can see here the output. So in Photoshop, this is our normal map that it's generated. I've opened up Quixel Undo. I want to create some flourishes. So basically, I've downloaded some Photoshop brushes. So I want to add detail to this lock. I'm just going load brushes and navigating to the brush file that I've downloaded. Just changing my brush size because it comes in very large. Scroll down in the brushes and you can see these new flourish brushes that I've just imported. And I'm making a brand new scene in Photoshop. So with my brush selected and I'm just painting these black, all I'm doing is drawing in a selection of shapes. We're not clicking and dragging like you would with a regular paintbrush. It's just clicking on a spot. I'm checking in my normal map the size. It's just about experimenting. Quixel Undo will convert these flourish brushes into normal map designs. It's very easy once we've created them to scale them and flip them and do what we want. So really, I just want to make a selection of flourish shapes. So out of the range of flourish brushes that I've downloaded, I'm just going through and for each one, drawing a selection of shapes. I'm selecting some of these, hitting Control T to transform, and then flipping. So if I select one, hit Control T, right click, go down to flip vertical or flip horizontal, we can change its positioning. Just keep in mind, once you've used Undo to create normal maps out of these, the up and down directions will matter. So if you create a normal map with these brushes in the up, you can't really flip that once it's a normal map because it won't invert correctly and give you the correct shapes. So we want to set these up before we convert them to a normal map. But now that I've created a selection of flipped and regular flourish shapes in Undo, I've just clicked on New Project in Undo. What I've done is Control click the square, the layer in the Photoshop Layers palette, automatically selects exactly what's on that layer. So you can see I've got the selection of those flourish brushes selected. So with those selected, if I click the Undo Conversion button, instead of converting a brush into a normal, it's trying to convert the selection into a normal, and that seems to work a bit better. So we can see here the result that's given us flourish shapes. Just going to flatten the image so it's all one and it maintains the normal map background. And all I'm doing is drag selecting with the marquee tool, Control C to copy, and then going to this normal map for the handle and Control V to paste. And just delete the section that you don't need. And now it's just a matter of positioning and scaling to get them to fill up the detail. So I'll just fast forward a little through this and you'll see the process. Just make sure you delete anything that you copy from another file. You delete the borders that might be covering over the original bake of the normal map. In this case, I've just duplicated the layer and copied it over to the other side, and I flipped it in the horizontal. I'll point out that's not ideal for a normal map, because the left and right channel information of the normal is getting confused, but because these are so small, just tiny little extra details, it kind of works. But we would have been much better off actually creating the normals in the first place, upwards and downwards. Okay, so now that I've finished creating the normal map, what I want to do is use the map converter in Undo to generate the other maps that we need. So if we click on this little down arrow and go down to map converter, starting with our normal map, it brings up the map conversion options. And you can see on the left there, we've got normal, cavity, and height. We're converting from a normal to a specular. And just click the large button in the bottom there, active dock. And I'll just save that out. I've got the handle norm, NRM for normal. And I'm saving this out as the specular, so SPC for spec. And the original ambient occlusion that we rendered in XNormal. So saving all of these out as a PNG file. And I'm calling this one AO for ambient occlusion. I want to do one more conversion, starting with the normal, going to map converter, normal to diffuse, and running that. And that'll generate a basic diffuse texture. So it's a very simple grayscale texture. I'm just going to save this as a diffuse as a starting point. Now I could go through with these textures, especially with the diffuse. I could go through and use photo source texturing to add more layers and detail to it. But we'll use these texture maps that we've created just to jump into Quixel's Dedo program to quickly generate some basic materials for our model. Okay, I've opened up Dedo, and what we see is this base creator. And so it's asking for inputs. So these are input maps. The first thing we need to note is the calibration profile at the bottom needs to be set to the game engine that we're using. So in this case, we're using Unity 5 and the metalness shader, which is the standard setup for the standard shader inside of Unity. Now, for each object that we have, we need to import those assets. So the first one is the mesh. So I just click on that and navigate to my low poly OBJ file, which is the in-game version. So that's called handle_LP for low poly. And we have a normal map, so I'll click on that and navigate to where I've saved the normal map, handle NRM. We have an ambient occlusion, so I navigate to there and scroll down to the bottom. Now the albedo, color or diffuse, and the final map that we have is our specular. So once we've loaded everything that we have, click Create Base. Okay, now I'm going to click the little 3, which is the 3D viewer. And we can see the handle, our object in here. Now at the moment it doesn't have any textures except the normal map. We can see by scrolling through each one of these tabs the materials that it's generated. Now I'm just clicking on this button, which is the Smart Materials button, and we're just going to do a very simple material of this. And basically you want to navigate through and find something that you want. You don't need to copy my settings at all, just go through and find an interesting looking material. I think I will go with, I'll try this one called Iron Man Yellow. And so we let that process and we take a look in 3D to see the result. So essentially this is a nice starting point for a simple asset, just a quick smart material applied to the whole model. This is covered in this video series, a range of production workflows. So bringing something into Mudbox for subdivision. You've seen how subdivision modeling works in that you have to work with quads the whole time. So you can't smooth. N-gons or triangles even will pinch a little bit. You've seen the workflow of sculpting detail through Mudbox and then exporting out a high poly model. And you could have just as easily have modeled a high poly model directly in Maya. Export all of that out as individual files and bring it into XNormal, which is pretty much an industry standard tool for doing your texture baking. At the end of the day, the whole point of making that high poly model is that we want to generate a normal map with a lot of extra information to go onto our model. A normal map is just a texture, and you can just do that in Photoshop if you need. It doesn't have to be done through a lot of complex high poly modeling. So it's important to understand that there's a range of different approaches. All right, so that's a sort of in-depth introduction to creating game assets. I hope that was educational for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.